Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate your time and attention today. It's great to be back speaking at B&H, even if it's virtually, even though I've done many presentations at the event space in the past, but wherever you are in the world, again, it's great to be here talking to you. My name is Robert Rodriguez Jr. I'm a professional landscape photographer. I'm a printmaker. I'm a teacher. And I'm also honored to be a CanSon Infinity ambassador since about 2011. So on behalf of CanSon Infinity, I'll be sharing this presentation to you with you today titled 5 Ways to Improve Your Landscape Photography. The ideas that I'll be sharing today come not only from my experience as a student of photography, but from my own, from the many hundreds of students that I've had in workshops, that I've had a privilege of working with in presentations and workshops, lectures, teaching and leading many workshops, both in my studio here and also out in the field. The things I'm going to share are areas that I see students struggling with the most, areas that I think they could improve to increase their potential, to increase their success, not just as photographers, but as visual communicators, as visual artists. Now, of course, these are not the only ways. There are many, many ways that we can improve, but these are the things that I'll mention today. And some of the things I'll mention today may not be an issue for you. They may be things that you feel you're comfortable with. But revisiting the fundamentals is always worthwhile, in my opinion. You can never stop learning the fundamentals, the basic principles. And many of these ideas, if not all of them, are endless in their exploration, which means you never stop learning. So it's not about getting, a certain number of likes on Instagram or, winning your photo award, a photo club competition. It's rather thinking about how have you improved since the last time you pressed the shutter button. Now, instead of holding you in suspense, okay, I'm going to share the 5 areas that I'm going to be talking about up front. And these are mindset, craft or technique. I'll speak a little bit about camera technique. Composition, of course, which is the visual language of photography. Visual literacy, which is expanding your knowledge base and your grammar. And printing, right? Or the benefits of printing, the insights that you get from printing and how that improves and or informs your landscape work. Now, to start with, I'm going to start with mindset, because for me, what's happening upstairs, what's happening in your mind is really the most important thing. I believe it's the right mindset is crucial. It's a crucial part of success as a landscape photographer. What you focus on, what you give your attention to shapes your approach creatively and emotionally. Your mindset determines, not only how you perform, but how you feel about yourself, how you deal with challenges, how you engage with the landscape, and this affects your images. Mindset is your inner compass. It's kind of like the most important tool in your toolbox. Success for me means being in a flow state. This is where I'm attending to what matters the most, an open curiosity to what I'm experiencing, and a deep sense of gratitude, right? Yet I see many students struggle with getting into a flow state for many different reasons. They're too involved with their equipment. They're not sure about what they're doing. They lack confidence. The inner voice in their mind is judging them or criticizing them. All these kinds of things remove us from the flow state where we feel completely engaged with our photography. And this is where creative insights are most likely to emerge. The famous flow researcher, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, said, "It is when we act freely for the sake of action itself, rather than for ulterior motives, that we learn to become more than what we were." And photographer Pete Turner said, "A photographer's work is given shape and style by his personal vision. It is not simply technique, but the way he looks at life and the world around him." Now, over the years, I've come up with kind of a few mental hacks, if you will, or you can call them affirmations, just things that I say to myself, that I repeat to myself when I'm going out to photograph, when I'm working, when I'm trying to be as creative as possible. And it helps me overcome that constant voice in my head that wants to judge every situation. So the first one of these is, don't ask what's wrong, ask what's right, right? Okay, letting go of expectations keeps you engaged with the experience versus losing yourself to thoughts and becoming detached. Approaching the time you spend in nature as a privilege, as a gift, a moment by moment experience allows you to see and appreciate what's right. And this, for me, is kind of the main reason why I photograph nature, because it's this gift that I feel I'm being given, this sense of gratitude of what I'm experiencing, the awe and wonder of nature is what really makes me want to go out and experience it, and then try to capture some of that and convey that to someone else. It makes me excited. And this keeps you curious. It keeps you receptive. It keeps you from becoming, it allows you to become comfortable with unexpected challenges, because everything is an opportunity. Instead of going in with, let's say, a particular idea of what you want to achieve, and if it doesn't go that way, then it throws you off your, it gets you out of that a sense of flow. The next one of these is technology is a tool. Okay, the camera is a tool. If it's there to serve us, not for us to serve it. And the more intentional you become about how and why to use the technology, the more it will get out of your way. And this is, again, something that I see a lot of, the gear getting in the way of the interaction with nature and the interaction with our creative minds. Once you become more comfortable with the technology and you use it as a tool, it'll become a trusted friend. It'll serve your creative vision rather than something that dominates your process. And yet so easy, as I said, to become a slave to the tools these days, right? The amount of technology that we're getting, the tools that we have access to, things like AI, it really is unbelievably seductive and incredible. Yet, in many ways, I think it blocks us from thinking and imagining for ourselves. So again, it's a tool. I don't disdain technology. I want it to serve me. And that's what art is about. It's what comes from inside of us, which is by nature unique and authentic. And finally, the best thing that you can do as a nature photographer is to express an opinion. All right, passion is good, but having something to say is better, because when you say what's inside, that makes you unique, that makes you authentic, that separates you from everybody else. It reveals you as a photographer to others. And, best of all, it reveals you to yourself. And so you get to see what is it that you enjoy, what brings out the best in you. Having an opinion, having an emotional connection is so critically important to photography, particularly to landscape photography, where the emotional content is the thing that's going to resonate with your viewer, not how good you are at processing a RAW file, for example. Doing everything you can to get into a flow state will increase the chances that you'll make the best, the kinds of images that will be the most meaningful to you. And as the great Ansel Adams said, the best photographs are made when you're not thinking about what you're doing. And so again, when you're in that flow state, time seems to just evaporate and everything feels like it's natural. It's an extension of of your seeing, of what you want to say, of what you're feeling. That's the kind of mindset you want to be in to, again, increase your chances of not only enjoying the process, but of creating meaningful images. So craft, I want to talk here a little bit about some technical aspects, again, that I see students struggling with. One of these is histograms. Again, this is a very basic thing, perhaps fundamental to some of you, but still it's worth reviewing just to be clear about the fact that this should be a tool that you use and rely on. And the second thing is the exposure triangle. So just a few points on this. The two things I would say about histograms, and again, my experience from working with many students, is that one, you want to learn to read your histogram properly. And number two, you want to learn to trust your histogram over the preview that you see in the back of your camera. So let's go over some of these histograms here. So here are 5 different exposures. All right, the first one at the top is underexposed, and the reason for that is because in a histogram, the only thing that really matters is the left and the right hand side. The shape of your histogram is irrelevant to the quality of your image. The shape of the histogram simply tells you the tones and the light and shadow that you're capturing in the image. But the left and right sides tell you whether you are capturing all of the tones and the shadows or the highlights, or you're clipping them. In this first histogram at the top, we are clipping on the left-hand side because we've got that peak pressed up against the left-hand side. That this histogram is underexposed. And so in order to adjust this histogram, we would need to let in more light. The second one below this isn't clipping in the shadows. So technically you are recording all of the tones in the scene. However, I would still say that it is underexposed because we're leaving a lot of the most sensitive part of the sensor unused. So just as a fundamental principle, a camera sensor captures more information in the highlights than in the shadows, more fidelity, more subtlety in the tonality and the color information. And so even though it's technically correct because we're not clipping shadows or highlights, we're not using the best part of the sensor. Again, I would say this second histogram can use more exposure, more light into the camera. The third histogram is much better. We're not clipping in the shadows or in the highlights, and our tones are evenly distributed so that we're using the majority of the sensor's capabilities. However, I would still suggest, if I were making this picture, to try to let in a little more light because we may be able to squeeze a little more information into this region, which again takes advantage of the best part of our sensor. This would be called exposing to the right. So this technique leading to the next histogram is where we expose to the right as much as possible to try to take advantage of the capabilities of the sensor and to minimize the amount of noise that you might get in your image, because noise tends to, or is almost always a part of the shadow part of the information in your image, in your histogram. So in this fourth histogram here, we've moved the histogram more to the right by letting in more light. We're taking advantage of more of this sensitive part of the sensor. The tone, you can see that the tones are moved more to the right-hand side, and we're really getting the maximal capability out of our sensor, particularly if you're using an older camera, right, where it may have issues with noise, or you're just, again, trying to optimize your raw file. And the fifth histogram is overexposed. We've let in too much light. And so you can see that we're clipping on the right-hand side there. This histogram, you need to let in more, you need to reduce the amount of light coming in so that we can move the histogram more to the left-hand side, okay? When I'm making an image in the field, I use my exposure reading to get into the ballpark. Once I get into the ballpark, using the exposure meter so that I know more or less where I need to set my shutter speed and my ISO, mostly shutter speed, we'll talk about that soon. Then I use the histogram to fine tune my capture so that I'm optimizing my image. And more often than not, I'm trying to go for something like that. I'm trying to expose to the right as much as I can without, getting too neurotic about it, okay? But generally speaking, that's what I'm trying to do. So use your histogram, learn to trust your histogram, and that will give you a much better representation of the tones that you're capturing versus the LCD preview, which really is a poor approximation and doesn't really tell you much about what you're capturing or what you're clipping in the shadows of the highlights, unless you have, for example, the clipping indicator on, but even then that's just for the highlights. So here's an example of an image that I captured with this technique of exposing to the right, trying to get as much information as I could. And one of the things that you notice whenever you do this is that your preview will look overexposed. It'll look kind of bright, like as if you had overexposed the image. But when I look at my histogram very carefully, you can see that I'm not clipping. I have lots of information in the highlights, but I'm not clipping. There's nothing pushed up against the right. And I have captured all of the tones in the image with as much fidelity as possible. When I actually do the basic adjustments in Lightroom, I'm able to pull those tones down and redistribute them properly to get a full spectrum of tones from white all the way to black here. Here's another image where, again, my histogram is pushed to the right, but not clipping. Critically, I'm not clipping because I want to make sure that I preserve the highlights for all the subtle details in the sky. Once I get it into Lightroom, then I can readjust the tones by pulling down in the exposure, adjusting blacks and white, my black and white point, to get a nice full distribution of the tones, which gives me the image that I originally saw and wanted to capture. Here's another example where the tones in the scene, the dynamic range of the scene, is too great for my sensor. I was making one capture, very bright highlights, deep shadows. I was clipping both the shadows and the highlights. And so almost always what I do and what I recommend you do is, again, this is a generality, there are always exceptions, but in this case, what I do is I always protect the highlights, because the highlights is where the in this particular picture, and in most pictures, the sky, the bright light, that's where you really don't want anything to blow out, so that you can get nice subtle tones and colors in the highlights, and the shadows serve as a way to move the eye towards light. All right, that's how we look at pictures. We almost always look from shadows to highlights. So in this particular case, I protected the highlights by not clipping anything here, and you can see that I've clipped a little bit of the shadows on the left-hand side. However, when I process the image, I'm now able to really expand the tonality in the highlights to get those bright colors in the sky, and enough shadow detail to make the image, to give the image the kind of mood that I want it to have. I open up the shadows. There's still a little bit of clipping, but that's okay. It really is a dark image about the light and the sky in this particular scene. Here's another example where, again, the dynamic range of the scene was too much for my camera. And this is an example of using one exposure. I'm not using HDR, and I'm not doing multiple brackets, just taking one picture. However, the nature of the picture and the composition that I'm trying to make is okay. In other words, I can get away with this because I know more or less what's going to work. I want to use the shadows as a way to push the viewer into the highlights. So notice that I don't clip the highlights here. I make sure of that when I'm making the picture in the field. I do clip a little bit of the shadows, and not very much, but you see my preview looks like it's like if I'm very underexposed. However, the histogram tells me that I've captured most, if not all, of the shadow information. And once I process the image, I can get all of that information back, the majority of it, except maybe the very darkest parts inside here, the trees, which is okay, because that just needs to be a dark shape that pushes the eye into where the light is and up through the scene, up to the sky. I'm only able to achieve this, or have a confidence of achieving this in the field, by being very careful and intentional with my histogram. So a little bit about the exposure triangle. Again, sort of common mistakes that I see, or common areas that students are perhaps a little bit unsure about. And anytime you're unsure about something in the field, that again takes you away from really being in a flow state, from just not thinking about what you're doing. The more you have to think about the process, the harder it is to kind of get connected, right, with nature, with the landscape. So, with the exposure triangle, right? There are three ways to get light, or three things that control the light coming into the camera. There's the ISO, shutter speed, and the aperture. When it comes to landscape photography, particularly when you're using a tripod, I always suggest using the lowest ISO possible. Don't use auto ISO, because now that might be changing your ISO setting, which will affect the other things, the other two parts of the triangle here, aperture and shutter speed. So I lock the ISO as low as possible. By that, I just mean I set it at 100 or whatever my lowest is for the camera, and I leave it. I don't adjust it any longer, and I don't have to think about it anymore. The second thing I think about, or I should say, I'm always using the lowest ISO. So the first thing I really think about is my aperture. And the important thing about the aperture is that the aperture sets the depth of field, how much depth of field you want in your picture. It's an aesthetic priority, meaning depth of field is going to affect how the image looks, what the image looks like, and what I'm telling the viewer is most important versus not important. And once I set my aperture, and make sure that you understand how to use things like hyperfocal distance. Make sure you understand the optimal aperture settings for your particular lens, and that you know its best optical range for the aperture you're setting. So for example, for me, I tend to hover somewhere between f11 and f16 for a 35 millimeter camera, for 24 millimeter focal length. Okay, there are charts that you can find online where they sort of tell you what the hyperfocal distance is for the focal length and the aperture that you're using. I used to carry one of these with me all the time until I more or less memorized it at the different focal lengths that I was comfortable using, and then anything in between you just kind of approximate. And then once you know what kind of depth of field you want, then that stays locked down. You don't change that anymore for a particular picture. And the only thing you're going to be adjusting to move your histogram is your shutter speed. So if your shutter speed is too fast, you're going to have a histogram that's pushed more to the left. So when you want to expose to the right, you let in a little more light by making your shutter speed a little bit longer. And this is how I'm able to, or at least this is what I suggest, to get yourself more into the flow of just adjusting shutter speed so that you can think more about, okay, what is my histogram telling me? What do I need to do? When you minimize the variables, the only time that you're going to be using shutter speed as an aesthetic consideration is if you have things that are moving in your picture, like water, sky, if you want to slow, if you want to get some movement in the sky, or if you've got things that are moving that you don't want them to move, like leaves because of wind and so forth, in which case then you will have to work the shutter speed together with the ISO. So if you want to have a faster shutter speed, you may have to raise your ISO to let in more light. But outside of those situations, you just set your ISO as low as possible, you leave it there, you set your aperture for the type of picture you want to make, depending on the depth of field that you want, and then all you have to adjust really is the shutter speed to get the histogram to look the way you want it to look for the image that you're making. That speeds things up, it gives you a sense of confidence, and there's less worry that you are either clipping the shadows or the highlights. Composition. This is a big topic. Again, I'm just going over some basic guiding principles here, but after having the right mindset, for me, improving your compositional skills is the single most important thing you can do to improve your photography. From start to finish, from the capture to the editing to the printing, there isn't any part of the process that doesn't involve an analysis of the compositional content of your image. Even critiquing your work. The more you know about composition, the easier it is for you to critique your work and to see what's working, what's not working. It's the language that we use. It's the comprised of light, of form, of color, of tonality. It's how we communicate with others. Composition is the only way to get from a technically proficient image, which is fairly easy these days given the technology that we have, to one that resonates deeply with others on an emotional level. Now, I'm not going to give you any rules. I'm not going to give you any quick things to check off. This is not quick kind of ideas. These are things that you have to work on over time, but they also give you much deeper rewards than just following rules. These are just some guiding principles that are more likely to lead you to an engaging and interesting composition for your viewer. So the first of these is, in any composition, make sure that you're leading the viewer through your picture. You can lead them through movement, directional energy, things like lines. You want your image to be dynamic. You want the viewer to feel like they're going on a path through your picture. Static images, generally speaking, will not be interesting for the viewer. So make sure you have a way that the viewer can enter your image and they can move through the picture to the center of interest. The center of interest could be a focal point, it could be an actual object in your picture, but center of interest can also be the mood or the feel of your image, right? A particular emotional thing that you want to convey to the viewer. That could be the center of interest. Whatever it is, it should feel like the image is about something, and that generally is a center of interest. And then finally, you want to have harmony and balance in your composition. Means that your composition should feel unified. It should feel like everything belongs without anything that's distracting or unnecessary. simplicity over complexity in terms of the way everything works together. So these three sort of core principles, which I sort of have a shorthand, I call it LCH, right? I use this as a way to analyze every image that I make. Am I leading the viewer? Do I have a center of interest? What is the image about? And do I have a sense of harmony and balance to everything? Does everything feel like it's balanced throughout the entire frame? So here's an example of an image, one of my images, where I'm leading the viewer through getting them right into the picture through the very strong foreground, putting the camera close to what's happening in the foreground, and then there's a nice curve that leads them up to the back and to the sky. And the center of interest here for me is just a sense of tranquility, a sense of calm, a sense of calmness to the scene, and everything feels like it belongs. I don't have anything glaring. I don't have any light on the edges or things that are high contrast in the corners. Okay, so that's one example. Here's another example where, again, I'm leading the viewer in through strong use of diagonals, particularly in the bottom right and the bottom left, with the shadow on the left and the strong leading line on the right. And then they move up into the shadow area, then back up to the distant mountains. And the green lines are indicating other areas where I'm creating patterns, repetitive patterns that sort of push the viewer through and keep them engaged, keep them moving through the image in a way that's rhythmic. That creates variation. Variation is always something that is useful in a composition. And that, again, that keeps them engaged and moving through the picture. Here's another example where I'm using the pattern and the rhythmic repetition of the trees, plus I'm moving the viewer from an area of shadow, which is in the foreground, to an area of light, which is in the back, trying to create a sense of depth, of a sense of wanting to move through and into the picture. And that's very important, creating a sense of depth, because that gives our images more dimension and makes them feel more engaging for the viewer. And so, again, leading the viewer into the picture, creating a center of interest, which more or less is all of the trees, and the light in the background serves as a kind of a backdrop, inviting them to imagine coming out of this dark part of the forest, and everything feels like it belongs. The colors are all kind of unified, the trees, nothing is distracting or feels out of place. You know, if I had something that was a bright red color on the edge of the frame, that would be something that you could consider as distracting or taking the viewer away from just a very simple way to move through the picture. So again, to review these three core principles, right? Make sure you're leading the viewer, you're getting them into the picture and leading them through the scene in some way or another. Again, leading lines, repeating shapes, dark areas moving towards lighter areas. Those all engage the viewer and get them moving in a particular direction. You want to have a center of interest, something that the picture is about. It could be, again, a mood or a feel, dynamic, or it could be something specific, right? Something in the back of the scene or in the front of the scene, a beautiful tree, a crashing wave, whatever it is. It should feel like there's a main character and then there's supporting characters, right? You want the main actor to be front and center, and then everything else should be supporting that. If you've got two main actors, that's going to make the image less engaging for the viewer. They're going to be confused as to what is the most important part of the picture. And then finally, you want to make sure that there's harmony, there's balance, okay? If you're not sure about how a viewer might move to your image, consider like visual cues, right? Variation and differences. How things change tells you how engaging the image is, right? Areas that have high contrast are going to be more attractive than low contrast areas. They're going to pull the viewer in that direction. And as I mentioned before, our eyes always move from, or almost always move from areas that are dark to areas that are light. Now, again, these are just generalities. Of course, you can find exceptions to these things depending on the composition. And this is where someone, or as you get better at using the grammar of composition, you can become better at manipulating these different compositional tools and make things more interesting, where you get the viewer moving from an area that's light to an area that's dark, right? You can do that, but it requires you to understand the basic principles first. Here's an example where I'm using variation. Dark at the bottom, and then you can see that dark here, then it gets lighter, then it's dark again, creating variation. Then it gets lighter with the majority of the brightest part of the skies. And then I've got these very soft cloud shapes that are again dark. And so this changing of tones keeps the image interesting. It keeps the viewer moving up and down. And I'm leading them in through these very strong repetitive shapes. Here's another example where I'm leading the viewer in through these bright and dark bands, similar to the last picture. Notice how they're at different angles. And then the clouds on top. And then I've got these repetitive shapes here that create a sense of depth, because things that are darker, we tend to move towards areas that are lighter. And here we go from dark to light, then dark to light again. And so it just creates a very simple pattern for the viewer to kind of move through the picture. And then they return again through the dark areas. And very important for me here not to open up the shadows too much, because I want to keep the viewer engaged in the feel of the picture, the mood. It's not, this picture is not about trees. It's about the light that is just breaking through these clouds and giving us a sense of depth and drama, and a sense of the light that is slowly flooding the scene. Visual literacy, another very, very important aspect area to study. Visual literacy is a measure of how competent or knowledgeable you are in the language of composition, how familiar you are with the different compositional concepts, and how readily you can apply them to your own work. All the things that I just mentioned in the last section on composition, you build up your visual literacy, and that allows you to use the tools of composition more effectively, more confidently. Now, this is a never-ending journey, right? You never, ever become a master at composition. We learn and we become better, just like language. Okay, you're always trying to become more eloquent, clearer in what you're trying to say and convey. And as we get better and better, we can use words that are more direct, clearer, and you can even use poetry, which uses words in a very metaphorical sense. These are all ways that we become more literate in language, and we can do the same thing with the visual language, what I'm calling visual literacy. Looking at other great landscape photographers and their work is a great way to improve your visual literacy. And I looked at, and I still look at lots and lots and lots of great landscape photographers. But there are other art forms that are equally worthwhile studying. And in particular, I've benefited from studying and analyzing landscape painting. Now, why landscape painting? Well, first is inspiration from an underutilized resource. As a photographer, I gravitated naturally towards looking at other photographers and other photography, but I realized that landscape painting has a huge is a huge resource for us, with compositional ideas going back hundreds of years. They use the same compositional language, so it's a shared visual language. And painters make pictures, photographers make pictures, so there's a lot of commonality there. And it broadens your perspective, right? It can introduce you to different styles and interpretations of nature that are different from what photographers have done in the past. Not better or worse, just different. And so it broadens, again, your perspective. This is also important when it comes to critiquing your own work, because again, you have a bigger knowledge base to draw from and to learn from your work, your mistakes, and your attempts at trying to grow. So while photography and painting are distinct mediums, and this has nothing to do with learning how to paint, they share foundational principles, right? And by studying landscape painting, you can deepen your understanding of these principles. And I think that'll improve your landscape photography. There are even, there are quite a number of prominent photographers who have been influenced by landscape painting. Here's a great classic example. This is an Ansel Adams painting, Ansel Adams photograph, where you can see how he's sort of trying to borrow ideas from a landscape painting, but people like Edward Weston, David Munch, Art Wolfe, Joe Cornish, Charlie Waite, lots of photographers have draw inspiration from painting. Now, for me, I live in the Hudson Valley area of New York, which is coincidentally one of the birthplace of one of the prominent landscape painting schools called the Hudson River School. It's the first true American art movement that focused on celebrating nature. It was started by Thomas Cole back in the 1820s. And these painters lived in New York City, and they traveled up and down the Hudson Valley to make these sketches in their sketchbooks, and then they would make these amazing paintings in their studios. But a lot of these painters traveled all over the world. They went to places like Italy, Greece, Egypt. They went to parts of the US like Colorado, California, Alaska, even Ecuador and the Arctic. So what can we learn from painting? Well, we can learn composition and visual design. As I mentioned before, they're using the same visual language. We can learn emotional storytelling and how to imbue our images with emotion, because they're doing a lot of that. We can learn how they used light and how we can use light, how we can capture light in different conditions to create mood and atmosphere. And you can even learn post-processing ideas, because it can give you ideas, for example, how to use white balance to change the mood and feel of your image, how to use dodging and burning, right, to create movement through your picture, just like the painters use dark and light areas to get you moving through an image. You can even create color shifts to create a sense of depth, right? Painters had to use warm and cool colors to bring things forward and to let things recede. We can use the same thing in our photography, using amazing tools like Lightroom to create color shifts where things move apart and they feel like there's more space between the foreground and the background. So just some quick examples of some great paintings. Here's a painting by Frederick Church, and you can see immediately how he leads you in through these beautiful cloud formations coming in this way. But then at the same time, he's got these repetitive shapes in the foreground, which then again repeat over here. So he's kind of pushing you to the edge of the frame and then pushing you in to the picture, leading you to the center of interest, but also the center of interest really being about the power of the light, the power of the color, and sort of the feel of this sunset. And that's a really nice way of doing that without overburdening the viewer with lots of detail in the foreground and lots of extra information. It's really a more simplified sense of giving you a sense of the feel of the color and the light in the scene. Here's a painting by John F. Kensett. Again, beautiful use of shapes, repeating shapes. He leads you in through the foreground here, and then we've got these shapes that repeat, more repetition in the back, nice rhythm, and then he even repeats some of these shapes in the clouds. So there's a beautiful sense of harmony and rhythm in this painting, and your eye just kind of flows easily and effortlessly through the picture. It feels very simple and easy to look at the picture. Everything feels balanced and like it belongs. Oops, here's a painting by Asher B. Durand, another prominent Hudson River School painter who really specialized in forest scenes, intimate forest scenes, which we all know how difficult they are to capture. But I've learned a lot from trying to see how he painted his forest scenes and where he placed his trees and the kind of shapes that he used. And here you can see how there's this wonderful kind of movement here coming around and then pushing you back into the distance. So there's a wonderful movement and rhythm through the picture. There's also a sense of depth, shadows in the foreground. Your eye always wants to look for areas of light, and so you move from the shadows towards the light, then shadows again, then light. Shapes get smaller and more distant into the background. That creates a sense of depth, and it's a really powerful way to imbue the picture with a lot of dimension. And again, the simplicity of it is the key thing here. Who knows how busy and complicated this forest scene was to the left and right of what he's showing us, but he simplified it down to very simple, effective shapes that allow the viewer to enjoy essentially what is walking through this beautiful forest. Here's one of my favorite paintings by Ivan Shishkin, again, using foreground elements to lead you into the picture, repeating, very simple. And then they get smaller as we move back. And then notice the shift in color, the shift in color from warm to cool with repeating shapes as we move into the distance. And that creates this sense of depth and movement. And the clouds coming in this way on a diagonal. Same thing here, using the corners very effectively here, and repeating elements, groups of threes, all of these different compositional techniques. By the way, I haven't mentioned the rule of thirds, of course, because we all know that, but a lot of these rules are in effect all the time. Here's a third here, here's a third there, here, and then here. He uses them very broadly, though. With this rock here, obviously, it's not really on the third here, but it's on this third. And here, this whole shape here is roughly on the range of this third. So he is using the different quadrants of the frame to suggest ideas and suggest shapes and how and also create a very clear sense of how you should move through the picture. And finally, one last one by Frederick Church. This is an image, a painting called Jamaica Bay. Very simple, very abstract, beautiful way of leading you in with these foreground rocks, but they have variation in them, a little bit of light, rocks and some grasses growing here. It's not one static color. They've got tonal variation, color variation, and then this little shape here, which kind of comes out and then moves you back into this area here. And then there's our horizon kind of high in the sky. So very simple way to move through the picture. Simplicity, while at the same time remaining interesting enough to keep us engaged and keep things always feeling active. And the whole idea, once everything is put together in the right way, you just kind of get a sense of the mood and the feel of the picture, the warmth of the light, the colors in the image. That's what really comes across, not the technique or not the compositional tools. That becomes invisible and you just get a sense of what the image is about. And so that's when composition is being used effectively. And these are things that we can use, we can learn from and use all the time when you're out and you're trying to figure out how to place your frame, what to point your camera at and what focal length to use to simplify the image as best as possible, make it as compositionally as strong as possible. Just some quick recommended resources to learn more about this. You can find many books on the Hudson River School at your local library, particularly. You can just browse through the paintings and just enjoy them, try to figure out what's working compositionally. You can visit museums, of course, one of my favorite things to do, just to get a completely different perspective on art. And it always makes me feel excited to go out with my camera after I go to a museum. And there's an app, an iOS app, there may be an Android version as well, called Art Authority, which I believe it's free, and it has many, many, many thousands of paintings by many different painters, and you can just kind of look for landscape paintings. And I will guarantee you that it will give you ideas and it will give you a fresh perspective on composition. Last, I want to talk about printing. And this is, of course, not to, there's no way I can get into the whole scope of what's involved in printing, but really just printing as a way to give you another stage to the work that you're making, so that it doesn't stay just on your monitor, but becomes part of physical reality, something that you hold in your hand that you can look at and feel. And that gives your work a whole different perspective, a whole different dimension that I think will help you to become more focused and more intentional about the kinds of images that you're making. So why print? As I said, it adds a kind of a physical, tactile experience to digital photography, which is always very good, I think. It provides opportunities for interpretation and experimentation in the physical world, particularly with the use of papers, which is what I'm going to talk about. And it creates a deeper connection to your work because you're seeing something now manifest in reality. I can guarantee you, when you show someone else one of your prints, there's a certain amount of attention that demands that they will not, that you won't get when you give them your iPad screen. There's something about paper and something about the physical world that just feels more real. So this isn't about sending your work out to get printed, although you could do that, but it's about making your own prints and learning, making it a part of the process, making something that you enjoy doing for its own sake. I'm not suggesting that you make a print of every image that you capture. Just those that you feel you can learn the most from. They can be images that you're not quite happy with, but the prints will give you more information, more data that you can then go back and reevaluate your decisions and reevaluate everything about how you're approaching photography. The last thing is that when you print onto a particular piece of paper, it commits you to a vision. It forces you to think about what your image is about. Adding paper to this equation and using papers aesthetically, using the aesthetic characteristics of a paper to complement your vision is going to be important here in helping you develop your photography. So in order to do this, right, you need to understand at least some basic characteristics of paper. You need to make a creative decision about what paper works best, right? You need to have some basic understanding. So there are basically three things about a paper that will determine more or less how it works with one of your images. It's the surface of the paper is what determines the density, meaning how much black a print can hold, the amount of contrast that you'll get, the texture, whether the surface is very smooth or whether it has some irregularity to it, and then of course the look and feel, right? Just the overall look and feel of a print is going to tell the viewer what your image is about. The surface of the paper is what determines whether it's a matte paper or whether it's a non-matte paper, something like luster, semi-gloss, gloss, etc. And that determines how reflective the paper is, its color gamut, the richness of the color, and also its texture, right? How much texture the paper has, and the amount of black that the paper can hold and still have good shadow separation. Black density, known as Dmax, is important because it defines the total contrast that a paper can reproduce. The higher the black density, the richer the shadows and the more contrast your image will have. Now, this is really important because not only from an analytical standpoint, but aesthetically, higher contrast makes a print look more vivid. It makes it look louder, more in your face, more aggressive. Okay, whereas a matte paper will be the opposite of that. It will make your print look a little bit softer. The finish determines the overall look and feel, right? So, if we say that a print is more or less photographic, that's what we're talking about. When we say that a paper is more photographic, it means that it presents the image more literally, more like how we would see it with our own eyes. So generally speaking, luster, glossy papers like Baryta, Platine, they tend to make an image look more photographic. In this print that you see here, this is made on Platine fiber rag, a Canson paper, and it has much higher density than a matte paper. It has more shine to it, and that makes it look richer. And I use this paper here specifically to increase the contrast, to really get a sense of the water that's glistening on the rocks, to give a sense of the fluidity of the water because it's shiny, and so the paper kind of complements that. Matte papers exhibit a completely different look and feel to an image. They look less literal, less photographic perhaps, imparts a somewhat softer, more nuanced look to an image, right? And that's why we compare kind of matte papers to painting. When we say that a print is softer or more suggestive, it's usually due to using a matte paper, right? There's no good or bad here. It's not like one is better than the other. It's just different ways to creatively complement your image with an appropriate paper that best reflects your vision. right? So the subject matter doesn't matter, or whether the image is black or white. All that matters is what you want to bring across. This is a black and white image that I printed on a matte paper, and you can see matte paper looks wonderful with this image because it isn't something that I want to be aggressive or loud. It's a dreamy kind of image with kind of soft tones in the sky, some deep blacks in the foreground, but using a really great papers that I love from Canson Infinity. This is Rag Photographique. You know, it really holds the blacks really well, and that's what I particularly like about Canson papers is that I don't have to worry about losing contrast even on a matte paper or losing detail on the matte paper because it preserves both of those things very, very well. Again, relative to a non-matte paper like Luster Gloss Baryta. So understanding paper's characteristics and what you want to say with the image are the crucial factors here, right? Once you start to think about when you start to think about your prints as an aesthetic combination of the paper and the image, okay, then you have a much better sense of which paper is best for your image. So the key here is that this will force you, right? It'll force you to think more deeply about what you're trying to say with your work. Like what is your image about? And once you kind of grapple with that question, then you can think about a paper. I think that kind of clarifies your vision. It clarifies what, you know, why you're making images, and it helps you to get a better sense of the image, how to edit it, how to compose it, right? Even how to crop it, because now you're thinking about this image. I want this image to convey a certain thing. I'm going to print it on this kind of paper. And so it needs to have these qualities in order to be the most effective version of the idea that I'm trying to convey. And this gets us back to what I mentioned at the beginning about mindset, which is having an opinion. Okay, you have an opinion about what you're capturing, and that opinion drives the process all the way to the end, or at least it can and should. Granted, that takes time and it takes effort and it takes practice. So some basic principles on paper, right? The most visible difference between papers is Dmax. That's the most visible, the biggest differentiator between papers. The amount of contrast that a paper can have. Matte papers and non-matte papers, okay? The second thing is all matte papers have a lower Dmax rating. So again, that makes the biggest difference because contrast is something that we easily can see. And the last thing is that texture in varying amounts, whether it's none at all or just a little bit or a lot, that can be used to add some dimension to the textures already present in your image. So if you've got an image that has a lot of textural elements to it, you can experiment with a matte paper that has some texture, because those two things together will give the print more dimension. And similarly, if you have an image where you don't have any texture, you know, the image itself, big sky or smooth water, then you may want to use a paper that has no texture at all, because that will not affect the lack of texture in the image. It'll maintain that smoothness. And anything in between, you can experiment with that. But the key is that you don't want to add texture. You don't want to use texture in a paper to an image where you want to preserve different textures in the image. So if you have an image that has very smooth areas and some textured areas, you want to be careful when you use a textured paper, because the textured paper is going to have texture, is going to add texture to the part of the image that you want to be smooth. And that might be something that compromises that relative difference between the textural parts of your image. Again, experimentation and practice is the key here. So here's an image that I printed, and here's a great example of what I was just talking about, right? I have lots and lots of smooth water that I want to maintain that water to be as smooth as possible from a textural standpoint. I don't want to add any texture. I don't want to use any texture in the paper that will disturb the smoothness of the water. And I want to keep the difference in texture between the water and then the rocks and the mountains in the background. And I printed this on one of Canson's newest papers. It's Baryta Photographique 2 Matte. This is a Baryta paper that has a matte surface, a wonderful paper for me. I just love this paper. Silky smooth, but has, for a matte paper, has the most amount of Dmax that I've used in a paper yet, meaning rich contrast without being a reflective paper. Matte finish, no shine to it, and yet it preserves the details really well. And you can see how it preserves the smoothness of the water, yet allows the rocks and the things above the water to maintain their textural integrity, if you will, and really have a lot of dimension. Here's a different kind of image where I have lots of texture throughout, except for the sky, even though the sky is also somewhat textured, lots of clouds and shapes. And so there aren't any really smooth areas. But at the same time, I would like to use a matte paper here because it's really about the sort of the graphic nature of the image. I'm not looking for something that's photographic or super loud. I want something that really just gives you a sense of the vastness and the sereneness of this image, of this place, even within the sort of the roughness and the crudeness of the place, the sort of all of the texture that's in the foreground. And so for this, I used Canson Infinity BFK Reeves. The PW stands for pure white. So it's the BFK Reeves that has a higher white point. It's a little bit brighter, but BFK has a very slight texture, and it's a matte paper, which works wonderfully with this image because the texture in the paper complements the texture in the photograph. And for me, that works wonderfully. Plus, as I said, I don't need tremendous amounts of contrast that a non-matte paper would give me. I want to maintain more of a sense of a suggestive kind of painterly look to the image. You can see there the texture in the paper. There's just a beautiful, nice sort of texture that is not, that varies. It's not a uniform texture, and that blends in beautifully with the content of the image. Here's an image where the shadows, the contrast areas are very important. I'm using the contrast, the black areas of the rocks, the darks, to push your eye towards the light areas and into the back of the image, kind of borrowing some of the ideas from the Hudson River School of Painters. And so for this, I want a paper that holds blacks really well because I need that contrast. Yet, it would be nice if I could use a paper that, again, gave me that softness of a matte paper. And so I went back again to Baryta Photographique Matte. And it works great for this kind of image because it has enough density to give me that contrast that I'm looking for, that definition, and yet maintains that matte finish to the paper. This paper is very smooth. It has zero texture. However, it isn't reflective. So it maintains that kind of softer, painterly look that I love in my pictures, while still giving me the strong, deep blacks to give the image a lot of grounding and, most importantly, project the sense of light in the picture. Because without the shadows, without the darks, you don't have the light. And the light is really what this picture is all about. One last image. Again, kind of a softer image with soft light, fog streaming, light streaming in through the fog, kind of lighting up these rocks in a kind of a canyon type environment. And for this, I went to another Canson Infinity paper that's relatively new called Arche 88. And this is kind of a rag photographique on steroids. I would say it's a little bit whiter than rag photographique and holds a little bit more black, has a slightly higher DMAX rating. So it's a matte paper, traditional matte paper, but holds darks really well, yet maintains that softness, that kind of suggestive look that, again, I like from my work. This is not to say you should use it. It's a question of being very specific and intentional about the kind of image that you want to produce. And so what I particularly like about these Canson papers is that regardless of which paper I choose, I can always be sure, right, that they're going to give me nice detail in terms of the detail of the image, and they're going to give me the richness of the color. And then I can just kind of pick and choose the paper depending on whether I want some texture or whether I want more of a sheen, like with a Baryta paper. So for me, as I mentioned before, I've been using Canson papers for 11 plus years, and I love the consistency. I love the fact that they're remarkably consistent, archival, no OBAs, and they always give me the results that I'm expecting. Whether I'm using an Epson P800 or whether I'm using my Canon Pro 1000, I always get predictable results. And many times, if not always, I'm using the profiles that I download from the Canson website, which are also very reliable and very very expertly done. So you get good results. So to wrap up today, right? Just to go over these 5 areas: mindset, craft, composition, visual literacy, and printing. Each of these areas are a whole subject onto their own. I've written about these different areas extensively and teach them extensively. This is just a kind of an overview of the things that I think you can think about and work on into the future, long into the future. 1% every day that you improve compounds tremendously over time. And I think this will give you a much better connection, a much better sense of meaning, intrinsic motivation for you to do your work. And it'll keep you going much longer. It'll keep your motivation up, keep you curious, keep you excited about improving, because we all have the potential to improve. It's just a matter of staying to it, sticking with it, persevering, staying committed, and reminding ourselves why we go out to photograph in the first place, which is, for me, in terms of the landscape, the gift that I think I'm given every time I can go out and experience a beautiful place. You can find me and my work online at robertrodriguezjr.com. You can also find out about my workshops there. You can subscribe to a newsletter that I publish every couple of weeks, and I share creative resources there. I answer questions, and I also offer regular free webinars on a lot of these topics. I'll be doing one in about a week or so on the local adjustments in Lightroom, including the new point color control that they added. And I do these regularly just to share, and I enjoy the process of teaching and learning from others. So you can find those things there. Thank you very much for your attention. Let's see if there are any questions here that I can answer. Is it right to assume you should apply the same paper principles when doing a book? If you're talking about something like a portfolio, where you're going to be using fine art papers, then yes, I would say you can apply the same principles. A handmade book, portfolio, a collection of images, yes, I would say that you should use the same principles. And let's see, I think that's it for questions here. So yeah, thanks very much. And thanks again to B&H for having me, and also for Canson. See you next time.